everyone. I'm Jamie Spiteri, hosting this edition of the International Association of Political Science Students Oceania podcast. I'm joined here today with Buffy Wu. Hello, Buffy.
Hi.
Thanks for coming on. So today we're going to be talking about a pretty important and pertinent topic, especially considering everything that's going on in the Western world today, which is democracy. So first of all, Buffy, did you want to just maybe introduce yourself a little bit, sort of your role in IAPSS, and sort of know how you came to be interested in democracy and why this topic is pretty important for us to discuss today?
Sure. So my name is Buffy and I'm the projects coordinator at IAPSS, and essentially my role is to organize So my role is essentially to organize different events at IAPSS where I get to speak with multiple professors and experts around the country to talk about really important issues in political science. And the reason I want to talk about democracy today is because it's definitely in the Western world right now, everyone is talking about how there is a decline in democracy, especially in the United States, but more importantly, the sort of greater shift towards authoritarianism in many countries in the rest of the world, especially in Africa and in the MENA region, especially in the Middle East, and the way that power is being abused there to sort of further the gain of individuals rather than the betterment of society.
Yeah, great. So, have you been a bit of a sort of throughout your university career? Have you sort of taken a big interest in democracy, or?
Yeah, in some sense, I would say that because in my first year at least, or first or second year, when I first started university, I was really interested in doing an arts degree, majoring in history and majoring in sort of like history, politics, international relations sort of thing, because I was really interested to see how public policy in the world had an impact on its citizens and how that could be better improved.
Yep.
So I went to Spain and I participated in the Harvard Model United Nations, in which we basically ran a Model United Nations where everybody would represent a country and you would like debate about different issues and talk about different things, and that really went to show how democracy actually worked, and you got to really experience that, and that showed me like all the flaws of democracy essentially, because everyone's trying to put in their own agendas for personal gain. It was like you kind of lose sight of what you were in it for in the first place. So yeah, that's what got me really interested in the first place, and that's why I really want to study and learn more about it today and sort of understand it better and see how the world could do better with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure anybody that's listening in who's ever taken part in a Model United Nations of any sort will agree with how difficult it is to try and actually get your voice heard and trying to change other people's opinions, which is certainly one aspect of democracy, especially when we enter into election times anyway. So, but sort of to give us a little bit of a background on everything that we're discussing, would you actually like to just tell us sort of how you define democracy, Buffy, or how academics define democracy? And which countries? You did say that it's there's been a lot of discussion at the moment about democracy in retreat, especially in the US. So yeah, what are some countries actually that are still operating in a good democratic system, if you like? So yeah, if you could just start with maybe a definition and then give us some countries where it's kind of continuing to be successful.
Sure. So democracy has evolved since when the Greeks first established it, and it's evolved a lot to what we see now is modern day democracy. Well, where we sort of associate it with the American political system. So in a sense, there is no actual definition of democracy, but the term is actually really elastic and expands and contracts according to basically the context, the time and place, and how it's being used around the world. But according to the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, democracy is a multifaceted concept which embraces political and social rights ranging from free and fair elections to accountable and transparent governance and civil society influence. But these rights do appear in different forms across the whole world. For example, some countries are really big and some countries are really small. So you really see the big differences in how democracy is actually executed in different populations and in different sort of governing systems. And I would say, like, in the countries around the world, the general trend as of 2019 is that the Western countries in general have a higher level of democracy. For example, The Economist recently published a heat map around the whole world in which they identified the countries with the most amount of democracy and the least, and they called this the Democracy Index, whereby Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, in addition to the Scandinavian European nations such as Sweden, Finland, etc., have the highest levels of democracy, in which they defined as full democracy, to the countries with the least amount of democracy, which they identify as authoritarian regimes. And those countries are some of the Central African countries, Saudi Arabia, and a few of the other countries in the MENA region, which is the Middle East and North Africa region. But you also have some countries, such as the hybrid regimes or sort of flawed democracies. And according to The Economist, they have identified America, the United States of America, as one of them, in the sense that there is still a lot of flaws in the way that their politicians are elected. For example, especially what you saw with Donald Trump, like, just because you are richer, you got to spend so much more money on campaigning. That meant that the probability that you are going to be elected is significantly going to increase, as opposed to someone who isn't a billionaire and they probably cannot invest as much time or money into their campaigns and thus spread their political messages out. But sort of more back to the point, the Index as of 2019, the top countries in the whole world were ranked as Norway, Iceland, Sweden, New Zealand, and Finland. And the worst in the world were Chad, Syria, Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and North Korea. And that's sort of the more recent trends of what democracy is. And sort of a lot of academics are becoming very worried because they think that, especially due to the coronavirus pandemic and amongst other political issues around the world, especially what you're seeing with the Black Lives Matter in America, that democracy is declining. But they do see a lot of potential for democracy to return and to increase if the right measures are taken into place and the right sort of regulating bodies are doing what they're supposed to be in order to ensure that democracy remains, especially in the US. In terms of Australia and Canada, we have, like, relative to the rest of the world, we have probably some of the best democratic governments in the world. And so, not to say that there isn't improvement that is needed to be done, but the focus should be on a lot of the other countries where people are becoming very oppressed, especially in countries that are very poor and they are not able to have a voice because the sort of a correlation between the lack of money and your ability to have a voice and speak out about issues that are really important to you.
Yeah, right. And so you raise a lot of good points there. I'd actually just like to sort of unpack a couple of things. So I'm actually looking at this heat map that you were talking about, with which has the good democratic countries essentially in bright green, and then the more authoritarian regimes go down towards like the red burgundy colors. And there does seem to be a little bit of a trend that I would guess, whereby well-developed countries seem to be very strongly democratic, while the more developing countries, especially the Central African countries that you mentioned, Congo specifically. I can't remember which other ones that you mentioned specifically, but basically, yeah. Does that seem to be a pretty good guide? Is the level of development in a country is indicative of the strength of the democratic institutions?
To some extent, it definitely is, because if your country has a lot of money, it means that you are able to regulate the governing bodies and corruption becomes less of an issue to some extent. But actually, The Economist was looking at, they did an investigation as to why democratic systems have become the way they have today, and why certain countries have adopted it and why other countries have not adopted it. For example, if you look at China, their GDP is enormous, and they are, well, in many sense, they are not a developing countries. Of course, they have rural areas that are poor and that still need to be developed, but in many sense, they are not a developing country, yet they are their president is incredibly authoritarianistic, if that's a word.
Yeah.
And they are oppressing a lot of their people by censorship, preventing them from accessing certain academic journals, from accessing media that is published by the West, because they have this notion that if they can control what their citizens see, they will value their country and sort of push their nationalistic agendas forward. So in that sense, just because a country is more developed, it does not necessarily mean that they will become more democratic. The economists actually looked at why countries such as Australia, America, New Zealand, etc., have sort of the West have become more democratic, and it's actually based on the I think it was Orthodox Catholicism. No, I'm not specifically sure sort of how you would define that, but the history of democracy is basically in ancient Greek, when the Athenians were running democracy and a democratic political system, and that was reverberated around the Western world pretty much, and that spread through religion. That's why majority of these countries that are Western while there is separation of church, they are predominantly Catholic. I mean, predominantly Christian, and that can either be Catholic, Anglican, etc. But they all sort of fall under the umbrella of Christianity, and that is what The Economist has basically said is one of the reasons why the Western societies tend to be more democratic. But there is also a lot more to do with, it's a lot more complex of an issue as well, because if you looked at when after World War II and even during World War II, and the fight for capitalism versus communism, and that's why a lot of regions in Asia have sort of collapsed and sort of fall into communism as they lost, or whether they won or they lost. And so that's another issue to tackle as well, and that's sort of a whole other story to explain why there is democracy in some countries and why there isn't.
Yeah, and obviously there are a lot of caveats with pretty much every case study you can bring up. China's a very, very interesting, but also unique country. There's insofar as how they run their political system, and as you inferred before, with the strict levels of control and sort of its meteoric rise, and trying to sort of maintain legitimacy in its country. With its people, and yet also in Africa, where you said there is also a lot of countries or nations in Africa that are highly Christian majority, and yet they still struggle with democracy and with development. So yeah, there's obviously, as with anything in political science, it's never quite black and white. There's always a very large grey area, which makes everything very, very interesting. I want to just backtrack a little bit with you're talking about how the United States is often held up as the one country that basically all others are sort of compared to, at least certainly since the end of the Cold War anyway, and democracy is a big part of that. And Donald Trump, obviously, the fact that a man of his stature, whether you like him or loathe him, or he's not a politician, and yet his ability to capture the electoral college at least, and essentially win, is in itself indicative of a pretty broken political system. And I don't have it off the top of my head, but I am aware that a poll was actually done while Barack Obama was still president, and it found that this is obviously before Donald Trump, that the United States was actually decreasing in its democratic standing under Barack Obama, under a lot of initiatives that he outlaid. So I guess what you could make the argument that Donald Trump is actually just he's a symptom, not necessarily the cause. So what are the broader causes of democracy in decline? What are the flaws of democracy broadly? I know that's a very broad question, Buffy, but if you could sort of come up with a few points and maybe, some of the largest flaws of democracy.
Yeah, sure. So, like we mentioned earlier, one of the really big flaws of democracy is that even in Australia, campaigning to become a politician, it takes a lot of time and a lot of money. And obviously, there's a disadvantage if you are not one of the wealthiest candidates, and therefore you cannot spend as much money to campaign and to go to attend rallies and to sort of invest in online advertisements and etc. Which is actually what the Australian one of the Australian politicians has said, and his political career actually ended up in scandal because he took donations from China and used that to fund his campaign, and that actually created a lot of distrust in the Australian political system because it meant that he had to sort of channel some of the some of the policies that China really valued into the Australian system, which is obviously not necessarily something you want, considering the West considers China's president to be somewhat of an authoritarian figure.
Was that
Something that
Sam Dastyari a few years ago?
Yes, it is. He did he did a what's it called, a Q&A session in which he outlined some of the ways that Australia could sort of reduce the amount of politicians relying on sort of outside funding to fund their campaigns, so that it was actually a democratic system, and it meant that it was more fair, and that donations wouldn't hold such a big value in politicians becoming elected.
Yeah, and I will just interject there. It's an excellent point. That's also not it's not at all a uniquely Western phenomenon. I know that in the most recent Indonesian presidential election, for example, the two candidates, Jokowi and Prabowo Subianto, they were spending so much money on their campaign that it was actually starting to kickstart the economy, which had been in decline. So literally, yeah, if you are relying on grassroots support and you don't have that money, well, you've essentially got no hope.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even according to the campaign finance watchdog, they said that between in the 2016 election, $6.5 billion was spent on the presidential and congressional elections combined. That is so much money
Yeah.
basically in a bid to become elected as president.
Yeah, it's a frightening amount of money. It's just incomprehensible to well, certainly to me. I don't know about you. Yeah, but I mean, are there some other sort of broader flaws, maybe in sort of the way that democracy actually is sort of rolled out after the elections are decided, based on in large part to the funding that you've just spoken about?
Yeah, sure. So some academics actually say that the system itself, especially, well, for example, if we look at the American system, which is sort of what everyone turns to when they think of the word democracy, um, he talked about how if you consider an election in a state where 60% of the population is liberal and 40% is conservative, if there are only two candidates where there's one from each side, and if one is liberal and one is conservative, um, in the same 60 to 40 proportions in which they are represented in the population, then the liberal will win. But what if the election ends up including two liberal candidates and one conservative? It is possible that the liberal vote will split and victory will go to the minority party. In that case, the outcome does not reflect the majority's preference. So in that sense, it is also flawed, like in the sense that um, majority, even though the system is supposed to be majority rules, so you're supposed to vote for, everyone's vote is supposed to count, and the person who gets the most votes should win, and that should represent a fair voting system. But in reality, it doesn't always work like that.
In that specific example, though, there's seemingly no reason why there can't be two conservative candidates as well as two liberal candidates, and therefore it's not inherent that there would be more liberal candidates than there would be conservative candidates, is there?
No, that's a very good point. Exactly, it could go that way too.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, right. So it's essentially that sort of system is. So basically, if more countries were just purely two-party systems and there was a vast amount of polarity, is that maybe what the academic was arguing would be more indicative of the society's actual desires?
Yeah, and also, and in most cases, it is usually two main parties that are sort of head to head at the end of the day. For example, if you look at Australia, like the Liberal and Labor Party are sort of the biggest parties. I mean, like, of course, there's many other parties like the Greens Party, etc.,
Yep.
etc. And same with the US, the Republican, Democratic are the largest parties, and it's not to say that aren't other parties that exist. They're just not as powerful. They're not as loud, and they don't always get as much sort of like people aren't as invested in their parties because they don't think they'll win, and therefore their votes will probably go to either the probably the biggest two parties.
Yeah, and especially in Australia's system, that anybody that's familiar with it will essentially that all those votes end up trickling down into one of the two main parties anyway. So yeah,
Yes.
it definitely is very tough for smaller parties that might have a more even a more common sense agenda. It's still very very hard for them to necessarily get their ideas out there and to reach enough people. So, yeah, so with all of these flaws, like, is democracy actually the best method of government? Would you say, or like again a very broad question? But yeah, is there maybe what can be done to improve it, or like is maybe the whole system itself is so inherently flawed that we need a new system? Or I mean, I know how I feel about this, but I'd like your opinion on the matter.
Yeah, sure. So I've researched a lot of academics who sort of said different things. A majority of academics, whether they be in Australia, America, Canada, even in nations where democracy isn't the best, a lot of academics do agree that democracy is the best for a growing economy, but some academics do also argue that, for example, in some of the poorer nations in Africa, an authoritarian regime is not necessarily the best to go, but the most practical system for their country, especially when the population is so incredibly small. There are not a lot of resources, and people are so poor that, like, everyone is sort of so in it for themselves. The amount of corruption and sort of power grabbing is so much that it overwhelms sort of any way to sort of establish the foundations of a democratic system. But that also is a very complex idea because um, the that assumes that the country is currently in shambles and that they have absolutely no hope for a democratic system because they're sort of tribal people or because they haven't established a strong governing body yet as well.
Yeah,
Um,
and it does. Yeah, as we kind of said earlier, whether or not development and democracy are necessarily linked things. So yeah, I'll refer to a specific example that I just recently thought of was Indonesia had a lot of problems developing for years and years and years, and once Suharto came in, who is nobody would argue was anything other than authoritarian, he actually managed to gain legitimacy through genuine economic reform. So clearly not at all democratic, but by the time that he was removed, thanks to the global financial crisis, Indonesia was in a much, much better spot. And then democracy has pretty much been, well, I don't know about necessarily going strong, but it's still established to this day. So yeah, that's probably a really good tangible example of what you were just talking about just then. I guess there's examples all around the world and all throughout history about where authoritarian regimes might just be more applicable for developing countries as opposed to democracy.
yeah, exactly. I think it really depends on um, basically the actual country itself, the history of how the governing body has formed and how it's functioning, and the people, the sort of like it. There's a lot of factors, including religion, the cultural values of that country that have already been established, what the people need and what the people value. For example, in a lot of African countries, recently they were talking about sort of the Nile River and the access to water in a lot of the countries because it flows through multiple countries in Africa.
Yeah,
It through Egypt and through all the way down south as well, south of Egypt as well.
I believe it
Um,
runs into Sudan and South Sudan and goes
yeah,
yeah through a lot of countries. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. Continue.
no, yeah, so exactly. So it's sort of like their ability to access resources and things like that. It sort of really impacts their political system as well, and their ability to sort of carry out the necessary policies to for the best for the like for the betterment of their people.
Right. Something that is done in Egypt, for example, can have really tangible consequences for Sudan, for example, to use the example of the Nile. And there's not really anything that Sudan, their politics or their politicians can necessarily do about it because it's happening in a different country.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. It's
Yeah.
actually happening right now. Some parts of it are drying up, and there's sort of like chemicals being leaked in some areas as well. And so there's a big debate over it right now in that area.
Yeah, which is bloody terrible. As yeah, as I'm sure you know, and anybody listening would, that the Nile is just an incredibly important resource for people of pretty much all the people of North Africa are in that region, sort of the northeast African continent. So yeah, hopefully. I don't have the answers, but yeah, they need their water. Everybody does, but yeah, going back. So with more of the problems with democracy, I'm of the opinion that there's no point necessarily talking about problems unless you're going to talk about ways to actually fix those problems. So, what specifically with the especially the big money in campaigning, what improvements can be made to actually fix the problems that the very real problems that we see in democracies all around the world?
Yeah, so one of the big well, I'm not necessarily sure that this might necessarily be the best way, but it's definitely been a proposal. As we were talking about before, the politician Sam Dassari, he said that one way to possibly solve the impact of the lack of campaign funds and the lack of a politician's ability to sort of like generate advertisements and sell their campaign is that taxpayers should fund the campaign process. And but even he pointed out the flaws in that it does cost taxpayers a lot more money, and then where do you sort of put the cap at how much they're allowed to use and sort of where they allocate this sort of money to. And for example, if you had many politicians all taking taxpayers money to sort of fund their campaign, is that really a fair system as well if that much money is being used to fund their campaign and not used for example, better things such as like improving schools or hospitals, etc. Sort of, is that really a fair system? That's one of the bigger issues to solving the campaign
Yep.
sort of issue. But other countries and other academics have sort of talked about other ways to sort of make democracy better. And it's, for example, the Swedish Agency for Development Evaluation talked about sort of forming indicators. This doesn't really address the campaign problem, but addresses sort of more the foundations of what democracy are built on. For example, they think that at least that sort of research suggested that there should be like a strengthening of local democratic decision making and local administrators. There should always be an effective, open, and accountable public administration, sort of strengthened capacity of the media, sustainable capacity to administer and carry out free and fair elections. And that sort of thing would be, if you ensure and if you regulate those bodies, that democracy would be able to sort of maintain, and corruption sort of wouldn't take over.
Right, and yeah, I'm fascinated about the idea of the local level reforms that you were just talking about. So more trying to get more grassroots engagement. Is that essentially what that's talking about?
Yeah, so they did mention something about that, at least in that research article done by the Swedish, but they didn't have a huge emphasis, at least from what I've read. They don't have a huge emphasis in. Sorry, can you just repeat what you just said?
Yeah. I'm just wondering if by local level institutions, they mean sort of trying to promote grassroots campaigning, get people out like in their own community, getting yeah, essentially getting you see it through our elections. I'm sure that you've had your door knocked on during an election time period. That's like yeah, those real grassroots people campaigning for a politician of their choice, and a lot of them doing it as volunteers for free. Is that Are they trying to increase that level of engagement? Is that what they mean by local level engagement?
Oh, to some extent, definitely. As this sort of like, you want as much participation and you want sort of the people to care about who is being elected, and if you do it in that way, it's sort of encouraging the public to sort of become engaged in politics and to actually understand it more, rather than just sort of voting for someone you see on TV who makes one speech and you think that they're great, but actually in reality they might not necessarily be great once they are elected.
Right. No, I think that's a hugely important point. Making sure that there's an increased, or should I say rather, a lack of apathy around politics. I think that more people need to be engaged in it, and more people need to know who they're voting for and why. But can I just ask, sort of, when it gets to that kind of point, when the people are engaging, when candidates are more engaging with the people, how do you sort of I guess, buttress that against like an increased level of populism? Because essentially, that's populism is, for all its intents and purposes, appealing to the popular masses, and the candidate always presents themselves as one of the people. Does that carry? Does this local level engagement maybe carry a few risks around increased levels of populism?
Yeah, I definitely think so. But I think that it's sort of inevitable in sort of any political race, any presidential race or any sort of like race in that way, as it's always the case. Obviously, you can reduce that, and I definitely think that that would become a problem at local level. Like, for example, someone who is sort of a better speaker or sort of more, he says the right things, or he or she says the right things, and they sort of do the right things, even if it's for bad intentions. They just do it for the sake of trying to get more votes, etc., versus someone who also has the right intentions, but they aren't necessarily doing it in that way, and that's sort of a disadvantageous situation. But I think that sort of applies to life in general. Like populism doesn't apply to life in general. You tend to vote for the popular person. I mean, not everyone, but it always has become a problem, especially in the presidential race, in the American system as well.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, charisma helps, and I guess is in somewhat quite important actually. If you're going to be the public face of a country, for example, or if you're going to represent your people, well, you probably I can see the value in making sure that you're doing it eloquently, and being well spoken and being intelligent and articulate. So I guess those things actually they carry their own level of importance. So, but yeah, it's very very fascinating to think about. Now, actually, what I want to do, Buffy, now is just kind of have a broader look at sort of more regional democracy. So we here are the International Association of Political Science Students in Oceania. And
Hmm.
as we've discussed, money and democracy tend to go hand in hand. Good governing institutions tend to be the more richer countries, which is why Australia and New Zealand tend to have in our region. I'm looking just now in our region of the South Pacific.
Hmm.
Australia and New Zealand are typically, the stronger democratic countries in our region. So what can Australia and New Zealand do to help promote good governance and democratic institutions in our region, in countries such as Fiji and Tuvalu and the Solomon Islands, countries that have had historical problems of bad governance?
Sure. I think, well, according to Grattan Institute research, a lot of them say that the best way to sort of reduce sort of money of like the amount of donations a politician receives or someone who's campaigning receives is to make donations less valuable. And yes, that is a really difficult problem to solve in countries that aren't sort of Australia and New Zealand and sort of in the Oceania region that cannot necessarily afford to sort of crack down on corruption and to crack down on the value of donations as easily, as their democratic systems aren't as strong, and in a country where a lot of people don't even have, like, for example, complete women's rights. Like if you look at a few of the islands that are surrounding us, they don't necessarily have the best women's right or human rights in general, and so that's really hard to sort of solve the governing system, especially when you haven't been able to solve things like poverty or human rights. But the Grand Institution has said that in order to make sort of the donations less valuable, that political parties should be funded by taxpayers essentially, or the amount of money that they spend should be capped. But they don't they don't necessarily mean that taxpayers should fund their campaign completely. They just mean that, for example, you should only be allowed to spend a certain amount of money on your campaign, and that should be it. And the amount of the arms race for donations should be reduced. And that means that any individual donor becomes replaceable and ultimately reduces party reliance on major donors. And that ultimately means that if parties have less incentive to sell access to donors, senior politicians would have more time to do their jobs instead of chasing dollars. Another way they propose is that limiting political party and third party advertising during election campaigns in Australia would be a good way to do it as well. But they don't mean restricting political expression through other channels or at other times. So basically, they're talking about focusing on the advertising spend captures the big dollars and makes monitoring and enforcement more manageable.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, sorry, that was that was a lot. So that's more talking about actually like elections, making elections fairer, which are obviously a massively big part of democracy. But as again going back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation was corruption as well, not just elections but also corruption. Sort of once a government's already been voted in. So maybe do you think maybe there are some things that Australia can do with the Solomon Islands, for example, to help strengthen their democratic institutions, not during just election campaigns, like to help cut down on corruption?
Well, I'm not too I don't have a complete understanding of how the governing body of the Solomon Islands is.
Sorry,
but
that was just an example. I'm just more talking about less developed countries in our region in general.
I think there's a lot of research that says sort of they have contradicting ideas of how we should help countries with sort of who are less democratic. But I think there are a lot of flaws. Personally, I think there are a lot of flaws in those sort of in their what like academics say that we should do. For example, some academics focus on putting even in some countries, the United States have staged coups in other countries and sort of put a leader that is democratic. But I don't believe that would necessarily be a good idea. For example, for our surrounding countries, as that in itself is sort of you're interfering in another nation's sort of politics and interfering in their governing system. But that is certainly one way that you could do it. A country could sort of solve their issues in politics. But I'd say another one is Australia as a nation is relatively wealthy compared to, let's take Solomon Islands, for example. I know that they're not particularly well off. And to be able to help them with their human rights issues and to be able to put every single citizen above the poverty line is definitely something that would help. It means that each citizen they're not so focused on surviving and so focused on just living and surviving their whole life that they're actually invested who is running for their country, because once their basic needs are met, they're able to sort of care more about how their country is being run, although that is definitely sort of a generalization and not every individual will think like that.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting point. Those two ideas kind of go hand in hand because seemingly one of the best ways that Australia can help in our region is through foreign aid, but quite a lot of foreign aid goes to other nations, to their government bodies, and then they're allowed to spend it as they like, essentially. But because of corruption in those governing bodies that need the aid doesn't tend to get used quite as well as probably well as Australia is intending its aid to get used. A very, very good example is Papua New Guinea, where we donate a large amount of foreign aid, but their government is just seemingly not up to the task of distributing that to the people to actually help them establish or to witness some tangible changes to their human rights. So it is, and then of course, anytime that a Western nation like Australia gets involved, have to be worried about things like neo-colonial intent, or even perceived neo-colonial intent. So it's all very, very broad very, very complex and intertwined conversation. And it's maybe a conversation for another day. But on that, Buffy, I think I'm going to leave it there. So thank you very much for taking the time out to talk with me today about a very important topic. There's a lot more that I'm sure that we could cover, but yeah, I'm going to leave it there. So thank you again, Buffy Wu, for your insights on democracy.
Thank you, Jamie. It was really fun talking about it.
Yeah. So once again, guys, I'm Jamie Spiteri for the International Association of Political Science Students, Oceania. Give us a like, follow us on all our socials, Facebook and on LinkedIn, and be sure to listen out for more podcasts to come. Thank you again.